Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a short story because it is Short Story Tuesday. One that is horror flavored, or spooky flavored, because it is now October, Spooktober, a great month to talk about spooky literature. So I'm going to be talking about a variety of spooky short stories throughout the month of October, and as well as other books and poems that are spooky flavored as well. And so today I have a short story all about a murder and a confession. I am referring to The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which was published in 1843. For those who don't know, and I have a feeling a lot of people would know about Edgar Allan Poe, one, because he's just a well-known Western author, and two, because I've talked about him on this channel a couple of times already. I've talked about The Cat and The Pit and the Pendulum, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. And so now I figure it's time to talk about The Telltale Heart. Poe was a writer who lived in the 1800s. I don't think he was fully appreciated in his time, and he dealt with a lot of depression and sadness, a lot of grief, which you see show up in his writings. Because he frequently wrote like gothic tales and horror and some poetry here and there, all of which had a sad, somber kind of flavor to it. He's frequently taught in Western high schools. I know I read The Telltale Heart in high school, in one of my literature classes throughout high school, as well as some of the other things that he's written. So pretty well-regarded author, and certainly one of my favorites, because you can't go wrong with a Edgar Allan Poe story, especially if you want to be scared, or if you want to feel your heart racing. So without further ado, let's talk about The Telltale Heart. I will do a summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Telltale Heart focuses on an unnamed narrator confessing that they have committed a terrible crime, but, and I should really stop talking like this, but they also try to assert that they are not mad or crazy, but their actions throughout the story kind of go against what they're trying to paint themselves as, this sane man who's maybe trying to do, or maybe did something that was totally normal and justified. But through the story, we learned that the narrator lived with an old man. We don't know what their relationship was to the old man. They could have been lovers. It could have just been their dad. But they are obsessed with the old man's glass eye. Here's one of the eyes is fake, and it glints in the light. And the narrator becomes increasingly focused on it as the story progresses. They even go so far as to watch the old man while the old man is sleeping, because the one eye, the fake eye, is open, and the light catches, and they're very obsessed with that eye, checking on it every night. And one night, when they step into the room and the floor creaks and the old man wakes up, he stays up for quite a while, and the narrator is silent, but it seems like the old man can sense that there's somebody in the room. But the old man quickly falls back asleep, or so it seems, and the narrator exits the room. But once they shut the door, they begin hearing loud heartbeats, which seemingly come from the old man, and the narrator grows exasperated with this and just bursts into the room and kills the old man, and then proceeds to bury his body throughout the home that they're living in, making sure to clean up any of the evidence. At that point, the narrator assumes that everything is taken care of and they got away with the perfect crime, but then the police show up. And the police tell the narrator that they heard, or somebody heard some shrieks, and so they assumed some foul play. but the narrator points out that the old man, he's not here, he's in the countryside, so nothing can be amiss. And the police presumably start talking with the narrator, jovial sort of talk, while they wrap a few questions up and whatnot. But at this point, the narrator once again begins hearing the sound of a heartbeat, and it's growing ever so louder, and the narrator is growing ever so madder. And the narrator is sure that the police can hear the sound of the heartbeat, but they're not saying anything because the narrator believes they might be trying to catch him in the crime. But finally, he cannot take it anymore, and he throws down his hands towards the floorboards and says, the body is buried underneath these floorboards. You are villains for making me go through this. I confess to the crime. And presumably the narrator is taken off to prison at that point, and that's where it ends. In terms of analysis, Edgar Allan Poe provides us with quite a bit to think about with this short story. One of the themes that he's working with here is that of madness. The narrator seems to be driven to madness by two things in this story. The first is the glass eye. The glass eye feels a little bit unnatural to him, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But he becomes increasingly hyper-focused on it, obsessive about it, which you see in many Edgar Allan Poe stories, where narrators become increasingly focused on one certain item and can't be, persuaded to think about anything else. But he's so focused on the glass eye, like he watches the eye while the old man is presumably sleeping, and it very nearly gets him into trouble. And you also hear the heartbeat, like the sound of the old man's heart beating repeatedly. Like he can apparently hear it in another room, which probably illustrates the madness going on in the man's mind, that he's hearing these auditory hallucinations. And then once the police show up, he claims to hear the heartbeat even more, and it's further driving him to madness, because he's assuming that the police officers are in on the whole thing, like that they can hear it, but they're not saying anything in order to further, make him like out of sync with reality, or to exacerbate whatever mental illness that he's dealing with. What's more interesting is the narrator claims that they aren't mad. That at the beginning of the story, they say like, oh, if I were mad, could I have done all of this? Could I have hit the body with such perfection? And the answer is yes. This very clearly indicates that you are mad, that you have some sort of mental health issues, and perhaps you can't see that you have like a severe and persistent mental illness, because it's so bad to the point where you're no longer in touch with your own reality. I do like how Poe gets at that driven to such great madness that you think you're sane, and you're trying to persuade others of your sanity. It certainly adds to the overall vibe of this story, where you see that like these characters trying to be like, I'm not mad, I'm just dealing with something right now. And then another theme that Poe is working with here is guilt. I think this is a very clear textbook example of guilt. Like so much so that I understand why high school teachers teach this story to high schoolers, to teenagers, because it's like the clearest example of guilt that you can see. The beating heart in the story represents the narrator's guilt over the actions that have taken place in the story. It's a reminder. It's sort of nagging in their mind. It's their conscience trying to get the better of them. But you really see the guilt that they feel in two different places. The first place is with the peeping, because the heartbeat starts beating really loudly for the narrator, like once they leave the room that the old man is in. And I think that's more representative of the fact that they know they shouldn't have been peeping on this man. That's a taboo thing to do. And so the beating of the heart is sort of like the way of the conscience to get you to apologize and make amends for the terrible action that you just did. And rather than doing that, the narrator chooses to deal with their guilt by murdering this man, which is not how you handle guilt at all, my friends. And then the second way you see the guilt is with the murder. The narrator begins hearing the sound of the heartbeat once he kills the whole old man. Like once the police get there, it begins getting louder and louder and louder, and it's really reflective of the immense guilt that the narrator is feeling in this story. And there's a good quote that I would like to read to you from this. "And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony, anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now, again, hark, louder, 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 louder. Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, it is the beating of his hideous heart." And besides that being one of the best final lines of any short story, of any piece of fiction ever, with the man just breaking down and saying, "Underneath the floorboards is where you'll find the body. I hate you for making me do this." That's utterly wonderful. But besides that, it's representative of the guilt that they feel, like the sound of the heart beating louder and louder and louder, and feeling like the police are in on this and trying to get at you just as bad, and ultimately breaking down and admitting to your guilt. I think Edgar Allan Poe did an amazing job in writing that, and I think it's clear why this is used as a textbook example of guilt. It's just such a basic feeling that Poe manages to put pen to paper there. And then another element of this of the short story that is done really well is the dark tone. You typically see those dark tones, those gothic atmosphere in all of Poe's stories. If you check out any one of the videos, I'm always talking about it. But you really get the atmosphere of shadows and death in this short story. In particular, when the narrator is talking about being in the room with the man, then the man wakes up when he hears the creak, and the narrator notes, well, like in this dark sort of gloomy kind of atmosphere, perhaps the old man sensed that death was all around because he was nearing that an old age where death was more likely for him. And I really like that writing on Poe's part, where he's able to catch that sort of like feeling that death is right around the corner, that feeling that everything is sort of in a moody atmosphere. It's indicative of Poe's work. All of Poe's work is like this, but it seems like only Edgar Allan Poe is able to capture that in an effective way. Like I can equate that to Mary Shelley, especially with Frankenstein and a couple of other short stories that I've read from her. But with Mary Shelley, it's a bit different. Like it's two different things, and it's so obvious that like Poe is kind of like one of a kind in terms of writing this dark atmosphere. But more so than the dark atmosphere is the how he sort of includes the glass eye in this, because the glass eye appears to be the lone light in this dark atmosphere. It's reflecting light off of it, and so when the old man is in his room surrounded in darkness, and the narrator peeps in, he sees the light reflected off of the glass eye. And in a way, it feels a bit unnatural. Like there's this one lone shining thing in this room of darkness, and it's really agitating the narrator, because they sense that the glass eye is unnatural in some way, that it's going against what you would normally see at night. And perhaps that does explain a bit of why they were driven to madness. This singular object that stands out in this world of darkness and moody atmosphere. So I do like how Edgar Allan Poe managed to connect those two ideas. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, an absolutely wonderful and spooky short story that I recommend that you check out. I'm going to put a link to it in the description. Let me know what your thoughts are if you read this before or if you're just reading it right now. Let's have a discussion in the comments. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this story and Poe if they don't already know about them. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and heartbeaty travels. Farewell.